Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in London, the fintech capital of the world, with all of you to talk about the blockchain today. It's interesting to think about the progression of Bitcoin and the blockchain over the past 8 or so years, the ups and downs and where it's all going. It's all very exciting to be a part of it all. But at the end of the day, the whole ecosystem and every single one of us here today, we're all wondering one thing. We all need the answer to one question. How can we make the blockchain real? How can we take this out of the labs and put it into the real world? So for my talk, I'm going to tackle this popular narrative that the blockchain will be made real in emerging markets and how I see this happening. Emerging markets, by definition, have weaker trusted third-party infrastructure and governance systems. The blockchain solves this as it allows us to digitize trust in code and distribute this trust function across a network of participants in a distributed ledger, effectively allowing developing countries to crowdsource trust. The narrative goes a little like this, and we've heard it all before. Using the blockchain, you can go into an emerging market, take the power out of the hands of the corrupt few, and redistribute it to the people. Technology as savior, blockchain as savior. Emerging markets plus blockchain equals problem solved. And this is correct to a certain degree. And while I am a big fan of the optimism around this, I think it is very important that we acknowledge that most of the talk around this is because we are entrenched in the inflated expectations stage of the hype cycle. Most of the world, we have to remember, are still in this stage. 2016 was a big year for the world and for blockchain. It represents the innovation trigger, or phase one of the hype cycle. The everything that glitters is gold, there's a blockchain for that, there's a blockchain for this phase. Now this hype cycle model has been touted by many international development firms, venture capitalists, and big banks, positioning Bitcoin and the blockchain as this life raft currency or technology that people in emerging markets need. Now, my opinion is that we're framing this all wrong. From an applied point of view, we have to rethink the starting point. Emerging markets and developing countries do not need the blockchain. Instead, the blockchain and us, the blockchain industry as a whole, need emerging markets and developing countries. It's two very different ways to think about it. I'm going to repeat that. Emerging markets do not need the blockchain. The blockchain needs emerging markets. It's from this reversal that my line of thought starts. The application of the blockchain in emerging markets is never going to work. It will never become real as long as it continues to be pushed by those that are disconnected from the gritty social realities of life in developing countries and the complex informal cultural governance and power structures that dominate these markets. So Day One Investments is a venture capital and economic development consultancy firm. We do two things. We invest in blockchain solutions, and we work with central banks, regulators, and international development firms in these emerging markets. And we work and we figure out how to apply these solutions to make the blockchain real. Now I'm going to share three of my key learnings with you today from our work in Papua New Guinea around financial inclusion. Number one, the need to redefine financial inclusion to allow the blockchain to capture alternative customary economies. Number two, the regulator is key in these developing nations, as the innovation ecosystem, as we would define it, is either immature or non-existent. Number three, applied knowledge in developing emerging markets will prove more valuable than returns. The race is to emerge as the key educator in this area. So, the blockchain in Papua New Guinea. The first question I get asked is why Papua New Guinea? The answer is always quite simple, and it comes in two parts. First and foremost, I am a Papua New Guinean. My entire family is Papua New Guinean. We still live there. I grew up there my whole life. That's home. I know it inside out and back to front. I know the problems. Secondly, I was lucky enough to receive education in Sydney, Australia, and then go on to work in Silicon Valley, in venture and then in Bitcoin, until I co-founded Day One and began deep diving into ways to bring the blockchain and Bitcoin to these emerging markets in a meaningful and real way. Having my feet firmly planted in both sides of the spectrum, my investment thesis and theory of change is shaped by a passionate, first-hand understanding of these gritty social realities of life and culture in a developing country, along with a knowledge of this new and exciting technology and its potential. Now, based on that, this is a general theory that I've been working on with members of the Central Bank of Papua New Guinea who are in attendance today. Assistant Governor Elizabeth Genia, Head of IT Naimek Kilamanu, Head of Research Boniface Aipi, and IT Consultant Callum Holmes. Now, the general consensus is that the blockchain provides us with the greatest potential and opportunity to solve all kinds of problems in these emerging markets. But before we do anything, we have to define the problem. The biggest problem in these emerging markets is around financial inclusion. Now, financial inclusion broadly suggests that the economic inequality is due to external factors that hinder the efficient workings of markets, thereby creating market failures. For example, market-based approaches may identify poorly defined property titles as a cause of market exclusion, and therefore of poverty. But this leaves out a villager who owns his land, works it, and lives comfortably in the village. Is it fair to say that he lives in poverty? The financial inclusion practitioner operating within this framework may seek to rectify that in order to extend market systems into areas where they do not currently operate well. The theory is that this will give individuals within that situation a better chance of competing within the normal market. Now, this is where I fall. I don't think that the blockchain and financial inclusion should be applied to bringing these individuals into the normal market, when their informal, traditional economies still are alive and well. If 85% of the population are not in the normal market, and the blockchain allows us for the first time to go out and reach and capture this 85%, maybe it is more practical to explore an alternative economy model led by the regulator, of course, in a sandboxy kind of model. That might make more sense to research. From my experience, I believe that in order to make the blockchain real, we have to start from the assumption that while formal market systems may be a source of economic growth and individual enhancement, they are simultaneously the source of financial exclusion, as we are competing with millennia of ingrained cultural traditions and alternative methods of economic engagement. Instead of trying to fit the 85% of the unbanked into a narrow financial system, the real wonder of the blockchain is that it allows us to create and capture these alternative economic systems that bypass these normal markets. Now, in Papua New Guinea, for instance, we have an overarching term called the one-talk system. This is a term used to cover all the unspoken social cues and obligations in our traditional cultural forms of economic engagement. For instance, I probably will never have to buy life insurance because when I pass away, my family and extended relatives will all chip in and contribute money and gifts to help my family deal with my passing. And my relatives will make sure to continue to support my family as much as possible. Now, we are a very traditional and culturally diverse society made up of 800 different languages, countless tribes and clans. We are a country dependent on close human relationships where $5,000 in cash may not mean as much to me as 3 pigs and a shell necklace. Informal and alternative economies and governance systems mirroring what we in this room would call the consensus algorithm are deeply ingrained in our culture already and are still alive and well. And my theory is that the blockchain allows us for the first time to capture this activity. There's no need to swim upstream. There's no need to reinvent. In many developing nations like Papua New Guinea, the basis of economic life is mutual cooperation and solidarity, rather than individual competition for narrow success. These are systems of consensus and distributed trust that are consistent with the mechanics, vision, and value of the blockchain, and are often at odds with the normal market as we define financial inclusion by. For us to tackle financial inclusion in developing nations with the blockchain, there must be a regulator-led inquiry into the correlation between traditional informal economies and a study to see how the blockchain can be applied to capture this. This leads me to the most important part of all of this. In emerging markets, the innovation ecosystem is either immature or non-existent and cannot be relied upon to lead and push an effort such as this. Unlike, for instance, jurisdictions like the UK, Europe, or the USA. In developing nations, the regulator and the central banks are arguably the most influential body. They will have to lead this whole initiative. That is why, over the next 2 to 3 years, what I expect to see is an increased level of collaboration and commitment between developing nations and regulators in regions like Europe, as there is a growing appreciation for these solutions to move into the real world. The developing nations provide the most logical value proposition where you can move out of a regulatory sandbox and actually get these solutions in play. In emerging markets especially, a regulator-led model is the only way to ensure that systems and tokens and the blockchain actually has value. Remembering that despite all the hype, all the blockchain system actually does is enable digital tokens to be moved between participants. That's all it does. Whether such digital tokens are perceived to have value or not is a separate and more complex issue. And in emerging markets especially, regulators are usually the only authority that will be able to do this and give these tokens any meaningful value. Now, the regulator's appreciation of this innovation and a willingness to experiment is going to be key. Now, what brings me out to England? What the FCA is doing here with the regulatory sandbox is a world-first model, and one that I have spent quite some time studying, researching, and just in general fanboying about. Essentially, I spent quite some time, and what I see is that, as we all know, other jurisdictions are now copying this model. You see it popping up in places like Singapore and in Australia. The real opportunity, though, is for a developing country to embrace this model. Public and private partnerships are key for this to work. An informed regulator is more important than ever, as the problem is in the irony that while developing nations are the ones that stand to benefit the most, they are also, more often than not prepared to do so. And therein lies the challenge, and therein lies the opportunity, and hopefully therein lies day one. What I'm saying comes back to my theory of change, and one of the key points that we foresee. Over the next 3 to 5 years, I believe that being an inch wide and a mile deep in applied knowledge will be more valuable in the long term than any investment. Having a deep knowledge and appreciation of the nuances here will be pivotal, as being educator is the key. We believe that the success of the blockchain is 20% technology and 80% strategy, in that we have every faith that the engineers and entrepreneurs will continue to solve the technology issues and build great and wonderful things. I believe now we will see a lot more action in the 80% strategy space, with collaboration between regulators. And this is why I expect to see a lot more international engagement between central banks as this space continues to consolidate. So to sum up, number one, an understanding of the traditional economy and culture in emerging markets, and extending a new definition of financial inclusion to allow for this to be captured is step one. Step two, a strong partnership with a regulator in an emerging market who is willing to look at cross-border collaborations with regulators in developed markets like the FCA and their sandbox model. And then to additionally, and most importantly, contextualize this information, taking it out of the regulatory sandbox and putting it in play in developing nations where we hear this is where the technology is supposed to get most of its realization. Here it is important that the regulator explores these alternative economies with the blockchain, promoting an alternative business model that incentivizes solidarity and mutual aid that is in correlation to the underlying culture and traditions and social norms already, as opposed to trying to fit the square that is tradition into the circle that is the normal market. Number three, those that are able to execute on this and extract the most lessons will be the leaders in this blockchain race. Now, I'd like to end this with a story. In our work in Papua New Guinea, we have identified an exciting pilot province, one that's aptly named East New Britain, the second largest financial hub in the country. We've been exploring the alternative economy and the way people there use shell money. Shell money gets its value because it is very hard to make, what we would call proof of work. To this day, microfinance institutions and savings and loan societies in East New Britain province are willing to accept the shell money and provide loans against it because they recognize it as currency. In these communities, before any major decision is made, the family, the clans, they all meet and they have a vote, what we call consensus algorithms. The first day that my partner Jack and I walked into the office of East New Britain Savings and Loans, we began to explain the blockchain And something interesting happened. We would say something, they would ask a question, and before we could get to the answer, the other staff members would answer it on our behalf. This had never happened to us before. They knew the problem so well. They grasped what the technology could do, and they knew it was needed. We hardly did any talking. This was the overwhelming reaction from the smaller microfinance businesses who are tasked with serving the bottom of the pyramid, the guys with the most on-the-ground knowledge that can actually make this blockchain revolution happen. The only other time that we were greeted with such enthusiasm from people who immediately saw the value was when we went into a meeting with the Central Bank of Papua New Guinea, who have now been kind enough to come out here. I would like to thank our guests, the Bank of Papua New Guinea, Assistant Governor Elizabeth Genia, the Head of Research Boniface Saipi, Head of IT Naima Kilamanu, and IT Consultant Callum Holmes for being exemplary of a regulator in a developing nation. And I expect that the blockchain scene should continue to expect to see a lot of exciting firsts and lessons learned coming out of Papua New Guinea and other emerging markets in the not so distant future, as we continue to try to make the blockchain real for financial inclusion and hopefully investment and profits. Thank you.